Hi, Alex. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. And could I ask you to introduce yourself for people who don't know you?
Absolutely. My name is Alex Faivusovich. Today, I'm the head of fraud risk for Unit 21. Overall, I'm a fraud prevention practitioner for the past 15 years.
Wow, that's a long years in fraud prevention. And I believe you're going to easily answer my first questions. Fraud prevention. What is fraud prevention for you?
So I think I'll tell you about my journey and how I got into fraud prevention and what I did in my past 15 years, and it will be a good transpass to how I look at fraud prevention today. So I've been doing that for 15 years. Really started back in 2009, and I wasn't thinking about turning fraud prevention into my career. It wasn't my passion. I didn't know much about it. I was a student, third year in psychology, in the university, and it sounds like a very cool job to be a fraud analyst, which it was. So I started working as a fraud analyst in the first line of defense for one of the biggest credit card issuers back in Israel. And I think it took me, I want to say, somewhere around 5 to 6 months to actually understand what I was doing. Okay, well, what is fraud? What am I trying to protect? Who am I protecting? How am I doing that? And I realized that my passion was around understanding how I can use available tools, available technology, into actually creating a much safer banking experience for my customers. Back at the time, we were monitoring credit card transactions, but I think it's really applicable to any payment channel that you have today. So it can be a bank transaction, it could be a P2P, it could be ACHs, wires, you name it. I think for me, the core of love of fraud prevention is how do I make one's person banking experience safer? And for me, when I wake up in the morning and I go to do my job, if I was successful in keeping one person safe, I did my job. And I feel happy and I go home and I'm fully happy about it. So about 6 months into the job, I remember coming back to my team leader and I told him, well, listen, we're doing all those different assignments. We're reviewing alerts in real time, which is great for your personal adrenaline, but we are not efficient. I mean, I was reviewing anywhere between 500 to 600 alerts every shift. So think about it. I come to work, I work every 8 hours, review 5 to 600 alerts, catching maybe 20, 30, 40 alerts that are actually fraudulent. And I told my team leader, well, why our system is not calibrated, why it's not optimized, why the rules have such a high false positives. And he told me, well, you know what? If you think you can do a better job, then you can be the person who will be, tuning and maintaining the rules. And 6 months later, I became the person who writes the whole fraud strategy for the company. So I think really the passion for fraud prevention started there of be able to tune and working on different types of rules and making sure that both me and my team actually operating in the maximum efficiency is what really started the passion for fraud prevention. In 2015, I relocated to the United States and really shifted from the fraud operation and analytics side into consulting. So my first 5 years in the United States, I did a lot of different consulting projects with the biggest banks here in the United States. And eventually, I decided that I want to go back to the first line of defense. So right before the pandemic started in 2019, I joined a small group of people, and we started a neobank here in the United States. And pretty much throughout the whole pandemic, I was a one-man band who was building the fraud strategy from scratch. Creating all the rules, creating all the monitoring programs, doing everything by myself, and this was pretty much my pandemic. I think during the pandemic time, I by myself prevented more than $10 million of fraud. Just unemployment and PPP loans that were very high risk, and I were able to stop them. So while it was very, how would I say, I feel great achievement by that, but it was also very challenging to do. Somewhere around 2022, I decided to go back to the vendor space, and really this is where I joined Unit 21. And today in Unit 21, I'm heading the fraud and risk program, working with my product team, the go-to-market team, and really making sure that my customers are having the best fraud prevention program, you know, anything they need to deploy. Now, for your question is what fraud prevention to me? Uh, I think I look today, after spending so many years in fraud prevention, I look at it more from ethics perspective. So, fraud prevention is not like a single point of this is what I'm doing and I'm preventing fraud. Fraud prevention to me is, what tools do I use? What principles do I use to prevent fraud? And how I'm making sure that integrity, transparency, fairness in financial institution and in society as well is keeping, the right balance. I think as fraud fighters, we are a very ethical group of people. Is if you think about this, fraud prevention is not, it's not like we have to do it legally or illegally. We do it fraud prevention in order to keep some type of balance between almost like good and evil, right? And I think for me, this is really what fraud prevention is today: is how do I make sure that we keep this delicate balance between ethical behavior and not ethical behavior. I think, a fraudster could be looked at as a criminal, but also it depends on, the society. Does society looks at fraudulent activity as a crime? And it's also a question for us to ask whether we as a society go in the right direction and how do we treat fraudsters and what is the consequences and repercussions for somebody who decides to go into fraud. So I think this is really what fraud prevention is to me: is how do I use my principles, practices, tools to making sure we keep a delicate balance between ethical and not ethical behavior.
Amazing stories. Thank you for like highlights, even the years where you spent. Just gonna back for a second for your like journey so far. Started from moment when you're working in bank in Israel and moving to USA. So do you see like difference between regions? I mean, my expectation that's or I would say not expectation, mostly my experience spoke with the colleagues when I used to work in the get, which is an Israel company, that the bank system in Israel pretty good, so they're really reactive. A lot of the things happens and able to prevent, and they're really looking forward for everything to help to customers to recover money if possible. However, what shocked you in the first place when you relocate to states?
I think the biggest differentiation for me from moving from Israel to the United States is that even back in 2015, uh, I saw much more focus on what we call first party fraud. So if you think about this, when I was working in Israel, our goal was to protect our customers. If my customer has a credit card, my job as a first line of defense fraud analyst is making sure that no unauthorized transaction happens on the customer's credit card. So we was always 100% focused on third party fraud, who from the outside may attack my customer. If somebody compromised the card, if somebody clone the card and he will try to go to the ATM and withdraw money, he will try to go online and make card not present purchases. This was our focus. When I started consulting here in the United States, I understood that the market in the US have a very unique problem where there is first party fraud, meaning the bank has his customers and his own customers are executing fraudulent activities. That was the biggest shock for me. I always knew first party fraud existed, but I think I never realized the scale of it, which is all, by the way, getting worse and worse every year.
So it is kind of like society problem, generally speaking, because I believe awareness about like what is chargebacks worldwide, if we exclude United States, pretty low. People not usually know that they can escalate the problem. Most of the time, they try to resolve the problem directly with the merchant or
Yes.
somehow opposite. However, in the United States, it's a culture is a bit different. If you don't like something or you use a service and you have ability to turn money, you just call the bank and say, "I didn't get something," and they straight away it used to send straight away money you back. Nowadays I know it's like a lot of the regulation happens and they really limit it from the perspective just like represent chargebacks immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a cultural thing, but it's not only cultural. I think it's a combination between how culture operates and then also what compliance rules are applicable for financial institutions. And if you think about it, if you have a regulatory system that essentially need to protect the consumer, protect the end user, but the same system allowed the user to abuse the financial institution he's working with, that's how you create this chargeback problem, essentially.
Great. And so you joined the neobank in the states. That's mean it's completely different experience. Probably it's going to be. It used to be, I know, some mobile application with easy access to the money. You never had this problem to go into in branches, and you decide to join the providers after your consulting experience.
Yes.
What's the difference working in a bank or neobank and vendor company?
I think the biggest difference between working directly in a financial institution and being a vendor is when you work in financial institution, usually your scope is limited to the data that you have. So let's say if I'm the head of fraud prevention or I'm, a compliance manager, I have a set of data, set of information I know about my customers from the moment they start the onboarding journey until they actually have an open account and they do transact with you and they have, building some tenure and some history transactional wise versus when you work in a vendor, it almost like you have the opportunity to take a few steps back and look at things from a much higher level. So it's easy for you to say, well, if I have a group of customers, and let's say we call all those customers neobanks, what is the common thing I see among those customers? Or if I have a group of customers and let's say those are crypto companies, what is common to those customers? And if I look at traditional banking institutions, what I can find common there? So you have access to much wider range of data, but it's also your responsibility as a vendor to be able to take all this data and make sense out of it. So you can bring back to your customers insights that say, hey, for this segment of population, for this segment of business that you're doing today, this is what we're seeing trending. And it's very challenging to do when you're in the first line of defense, because when you are in the first line of defense, you're mostly busy about protecting the bank and protecting the customers of the bank.
So, who have more understanding and visualization to preventing fraud, bank or vendor?
Well, I would say that they have to go hand to hand.
Okay.
And the reason is usually when we go to mid-sized banks to large banking institutions, the biggest problem that we see is silos of data. So the bank collects so much data about its customers, but this data is not available to the right people in the bank. So if I'm a fraud analyst and I don't have access to data that is critical for me to make decisions, or if the data is not being fed into the right platforms, into the right system to help us generate alerts and rules and insights about those customers, it's very hard for me as a fraud analyst in the bank to do my job. That's why we need a vendor that is very data agnostic. So how do we take all the data that's available in the bank, put it in one place, and making sure that the people who are responsible for fraud prevention, who are responsible for detecting money laundering, who are responsible to making sure that the bank is compliant, have everything available. Who is better in doing this job? I want to believe that the personnel in the bank should be the better team, But if they don't have the tools, if they don't have the right vendor, it's much harder to do this work.
Yeah, in some instances, they even blinders and merchants because they might getting very limited information about particular transaction, and based on this one, they need to make a conclusion to say, yeah, this looks supposed to be bad. It's never happens for these customers, but yeah, customers switch banks every day, and I know plenty of people who for the past 5 years changed more than 10 banks because of multiple reasons.
Yes.
And this created a huge problem for the banks. And to stop speaking about these vendors and banks for a bit, I just want to ask what the skills necessary to work in banks and vendors separately. And maybe you have some areas when the same skill can apply for both of these things.
That's a great question. When we were hiring people for fraud analyst positions, we always ask ourselves, okay, well, who is the right person? Who is the what is the profile of the perfect fraud analyst? Is this someone who spent 5 years in a university and is very educated and very smart, or maybe have a very high SAT score? Is it someone who maybe has a criminal past and he actually has hands-on experience in doing fraud? Maybe we should hire these people. Maybe it's somebody who I don't know. We ask this question all the time, and we found out that the most two critical, I will call it soft skills, to be a good fraud analyst is first is out of the box thinking. So when you're presented with a problem, are you solving the problem in a matter of this is how everybody expect you to solve the problem, or you can come up with an original way to solve the problem? So if we can find a person who is a great out of the box thinker, usually it will transfer the soft skill into good fraud analysis. The other soft skill we found very common for good fraud personnel is have the ability to prioritize in the right way. So if you're presented with, let's say, 10 different tasks, how do you know to put the most urgent one to tackle it first? And how do you prioritize all the different tasks, making sure that you generate efficiency for yourself, but you also tackle the most important task first? And at the end of the day, once you finish doing your whole task for the day, the whole 10 tasks that you were giving, uh, your execution is like top performance. So I think those two soft skills are essential. Now, I think what many banks did wrong in the past 10, 15 years was they thought fraud was a mathematical problem.
Okay.
So you go today to the biggest banks, and the most common person you will find is people who have masters in mathematics, people who know how to write very complex algorithms, people who know can create a very sophisticated code in SAS, for example. But fraud is not a mathematical problem, right? Mathematical, you know, banks see it as a mathematical problem because quite often the results of fraud is a financial loss. So you can look at a financial loss as a mathematical problem. But really, what happens is that they hire all those great mathematicians and all those people who understand statistics, who can write models, and still they struggle to catch fraud because they don't understand the psychology behind fraud, because they don't understand how their product offering and how the different payment channels that they have within the bank bringing fraudsters in. What is the motivation of a fraudster to come and do fraud with your bank? And this no mathematics can solve that. You need people who understand the psychology, who understand the motivation, who understand the product, and can find the loophole to get in. So clearly, mathematics is great, and if a person can build great models, it's obviously amazing. But it's definitely not. Fraud is not mathematical problem. So don't hire too many mathematicians for your team.
Good advice. So right now we kind of stage of paradigm that's because it's financial, as you mentioned, we supposed to be calculate and predict However, most of the time, fraud is not predictable. I mean, it is in some way because we're looking on historical data. We might able to do some like prediction based on the historical information. However, the fraudsters are also smart. They know if they can predict, you also do the same. So they always find a way how to put different perspective for the simple solutions, and they even try to
Yes.
spend less resources rather than on the prevention side. We just like invest a lot, but sometimes we not even close the simplest loopholes and to where the fraudsters like abusing the company. And what's your want to go question? For example, if you hire right now someone in your team, what's the one questions you usually ask people during the interview?
Oh, I have quite a lot. I think my personal favorite stage of hiring someone is really the very first interview. For me, first impression is very important. But usually when I try to see if the person is right for me, I I ask them to describe a challenging situation that they faced in their personal life and what was the original solution they were able to find to deal with the challenging situation, right? This can be in the personal life and can be something challenging at work, because I feel like it's always a question of, do I look for a person who is very technical, or do I look for a person who is maybe have less tech skills but he thinks differently? And for me, if I'm building a team, ideally I want, let's say I have 10 people. I want each and every single person of those 10 to think in a completely different way. Because as a group, they will be able to solve any problem I will give them. So for me, original thinking, and this is usually the question I ask. I ask, give me an example of how you originally solved a problem, or maybe how did you solve a problem that nobody expected you to solve.
Would it help if the person who applying position to your team writing in, for example, cover letter in a way about potential loopholes you have in the system?
It's interesting. If a person tells me about how he can already identify a loophole in in the ecosystem I'm operating in, it tells me a couple of things. It tells me, first of all, he showed enough interest to go and understand where he is about to work. He understands how to look at a financial product offering and see how it can be abused as a fraudster. So he sees things from a fraudster perspective, right? And the third part is for a simple fact that if a person don't just create a generic cover letter or maybe use ChatGPT to write this cover letter, but he actually took the time, investigated, and put an effort in, that's definitely points in my book.
That's great. And switching to another topic, have you ever been victim of fraud?
Oh yeah, plenty of times. I mean, nothing critical, but credit card being compromised, attempts of account takeover. Yeah, I one of the funniest stories I had is I live in New Jersey. So one day I get a text message from my bank saying your card was not presented. So basically, somebody gave my card number for like $1,000 something at a plastic surgeon in Pennsylvania. Clearly, I'm not into plastic surgery, and definitely not going to travel to Pennsylvania for that. So I just call the surgeon. I'm like, hey, somebody just gave my card number at your office, and it was a guy who sent his girlfriend to do some plastic surgery, and somehow, he bought my card. Probably my card was leaked somewhere. He bought my card number, and he decided to use my card number to pay for his girlfriend plastic surgery, which was very funny. Obviously, I didn't take any financial loss. My bank took care of it, but it made me think, like, if you know if you're in a relationship with someone and You'd be like, okay, you know what? You want to do a plastic surgery? Let me pay for it. And then you take a compromise card and you do that. Uh, it just makes you think about, okay, what are the morals and the ethics of that person?
I always thought like, it's two types of frosters: the one with experience and one who just like somehow decide to try this path. And like plastic surgery is a great example. And I always thought, how what's the best options to spend money if you have credit cards, if you have credit card number that you bought somewhere in dark web, or I know in any channels. And in my mind, the best options is spend it somewhere to travel, because at least you enjoy it. Because if you buy something or you buy some kind of service, the service can be interrupted immediately. However, if you buy a holiday, at least you enjoy it. You're probably already back when they just like figure out that okay, it's actually not a person, it's etc etc. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about it?
Yeah, it is interesting to see, if we try to understand, like, and we used to do it when we did credit card monitoring, right? We will take groups of MCC codes, right? Merchant category codes, and we will say, okay, where is the highest fraud is trending? And sure enough, we saw two distinct trends. One trend was essentials. So the fraud with the biggest number of fraudulent transaction, not by percentage, just how much fraud dollars, let's put it that way, was supermarkets and grocery stores. So you think to yourself, okay, if somebody is into fraud, they into fraud because they don't have the essentials. They need to put food on the table, right? The second category was gas stations. Makes sense. I mean, you need to put gas in your car. But then also we saw categories like luxury, jewelry, right, or travel, and you understand that there's, like you said, there's probably several subcategories of fraudsters. So somebody who is really doing fraud because there's no other way out, because they need to survive, they need to feed their family, they need to provide, but also use fraud for pleasure. So travel, luxury items, jewelry, and I always say, I say, if you want to see who the fraudsters are, what the face of a fraudster look like, go to a shopping mall on a very like slow day, let's say middle of the week, Wednesday in the morning. Go to your favorite luxury brand and see who's shopping there. You won't see any businessmen. You won't see any people who in their 60s or 70s who achieved financial wealth and can afford those luxury items. You will see kids, 20-year-old kids shop there. And you'll ask yourself, okay, this 20-year-old kid, is he an entrepreneur? Is he a millionaire? Is maybe his parents are rich, or maybe he's a fraudster, right? So yeah, I think definitely fraudsters use fraud to satisfy different needs.
Yeah, that makes sense. I had a recent recording about like 2 weeks ago, and the person also live in New York, and he told me that it's a less and less people try to rob your apartments, because it's a super risky. You can cut people in some instances. You might be killed during this if it's very loud and police arrived. However, if you're doing online, it's a safe place. The worst case scenario for you as a frostest, like you didn't get the service or product, but you still like can use it anyway. So, and if it's we apply this one on what you just described, there's someone middle of the week, morning and Wednesday, in the shopping mall, like very luxury brands, I know Balenciaga, etc., etc. So expectation that's it's two types of people. It's like tourist or
Yeah.
fraudsters, because the rest of the people who can afford this funds, they buy everything online. They don't need to go this way because they have all these credentials on their
Yes.
side.
Yes. Absolutely. It really takes me to think, like, you know why fraud is trending. Fraud as a concept, fraud as way of living, fraud as an occupation. Just let's look at the society. So people talk about fraud openly when they create music, right? We have movies and TV series about famous fraudsters.
Yeah.
Social media is pumping fraud, orchestrating and facilitating fraud pretty much every day. So I think, as a society, our morals is definitely not going in the right direction. And just like you said, if I have very small chance of getting caught, and even if I get caught, the consequences and repercussions are fairly small, maybe even non-existent. What stops me from doing fraud today, right? Why? And I understand, I understand why people do that. I understand why people say, hey, I'm not going to work 9 to 5 at some job I hate to make, I don't know, whatever money they will pay me, when I can make 10 times more than that doing fraud. And I think this is what really scares me is we are losing the balance between ethical and unethical decisions. And I think the morals of our society is definitely not heading in the right direction.
And like end up with the trends. What the scariest trends in the world you see from the fraud prevention side right now?
I think it really depends on in what type of environment you operate. But what really scares me in general is just how popular fraud is today. So, first party fraud is probably the biggest problem we will have to solve in the next decade. I think, if you look industry wise, the last decade we were very busy of understanding how do we authenticate someone's identity online, right? So if someone is trying to open a bank account, how do we know if that person who say he is? If someone tried to shop, with e-commerce, how do we know that this person is the owner of the card that they want to pay, that the billing and the shipping address is correlated to that person? We spent the last decade doing that. But what we see now is that people can use their own identities to commit fraud. People will use their own identity to pass all your KYC. And when you give them the bank account, when you give them the credit card, when you give them the buy now, pay later services, when you give them whatever your product is, they will use it and abuse it. And then you will be left with the bag. So for me, the scariest trend is that how do we stop people from doing first party fraud? Well, basically, intentionally onboarding to financial services, financial institutions, and using their own identity to commit fraud.
Yeah, that's definitely agree with you. That right now we have the less and less sees this balance between bad and good, and people who supposed to be good became bad, or also way around. I believe I have one more topic. So this word that I'm usually pronounced wrong, but bear with me. It's a fraud orchestration. What it
Yes.
means, how it works, and why it is important, and in a way that a lot of companies start working.
Yeah. I think if we look at what we did 15 years ago, our focus was always on the transaction, right?
Yeah,
We see a transaction, we generate an alert, we create insights, we create scores, we, develop different strategies to say, is it transaction is genuine or is the transaction is fraudulent? It was applicable 15 years ago, 10 years ago. I don't think it's the case anymore. And this is why we need fraud orchestration, because now we need to look at the whole life cycle of the customer. So it's not enough for us to be able to say, hey, is this specific transaction is fraudulent or not? Because the very first transaction of your customer can be fraudulent. So how do we take all the data that we have? And it goes back to the siloed data problem I talked to you a couple of minutes ago. And how do we create a holistic view of the customer, right? So we know exactly all the associated risk that happened during the onboarding. So we know exactly what were the result of the KYC. If that's a business, we have high level or low level of confidence that this business is legitimate, right? If it's a consumer with the associated onboarding risk, what is our expectation from that user in the first 24 hours, in the first 7 days, in the first 30 days? If the consumer suddenly become dormant and they stop banking with us, what is dormancy to us? What is a dormancy reactivation event? And then we dive into the whole aspect of non-transactional data. So, a person logs in on their mobile phone. How this mobile session look like? What do we expect from a person when they use our app? How they use our app? How do we know if, hey, there is an account takeover attempt? Fraud orchestration is all that, is how you put all the relevant data into one place and use sophisticated rule engines, machine learning engine, AI copilots, you name it, whatever you have available, to create a strategy that not only protects the customer, but also protects the financial institution who gives all those services to the customer. And we need to keep, as fraud fighters, it's up to us to keep the balance of, on one hand, it's our responsibility to keep the end user safe. On the other hand, we need to make sure that the financial institution is protected and it's not bearing any financial losses. For me, this is fraud orchestration, is how you bring everything into one place and have the right people with the available data to do their job.
Now it's clear, because in my mind, I mean, first time when I heard about this one about like 2 years ago, I thought that it's mean you connecting 100 providers and you connect all of them to merchant and using all features from these 100 providers to help merchant to resolve this problem. So kind of what happens on payment side when you route
Yes,
traffic depends on the country and the profile how it's work. And every time when I learn about these kind of things like as orchestration, I'm realized this how progress it happens for this like past 2 years. So because right now a lot more companies who provide this opportunity, and because of market became more competitive, it's like the innovation happens much faster. That allows merchants and companies, it doesn't matter, banks, merchant, consulting, allowed to choose the best options or motivate your current solution to innovate.
absolutely. I think if, 10, 15 years ago, a bank or a e-commerce or online merchant can safely operate with just one vendor, uh, I don't think it's true today. And from the most successful financial institutions we're seeing today, they usually have a suite of 6, 7 different point solutions that provide them the right insights and the right tools to prevent fraudulent activity on their platform, specifically for their business needs. Uh, and then they bring all those point solutions into one place. And this is where true orchestration happens. And I definitely think this is the right way to operate in today's environment when we have so much data, so many signals, so many insights, but we also need the capability to actually use all that data in one place.
Thank you for this additional information. I found this one very useful. I believe our listeners also find this one very practical. So, to be honest, I don't have any other questions. However, I always keep time at the end of my podcast to allow you to speak about any projects or anything that you're working right now and you would like to share with the people who listen to this one.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to bring for your audience today is the whole concept of using consortium data. Now, I said several minutes ago that we spent the past decade learning how to authenticate someone's identity. So, how do we do KYC very, very good? How do we do KYB in a very good way? How do we make sure that online application really represents the high risk, the associated risk, but also allow us to onboard good users with minimal friction? I think what we're going to see in the next 10 years in our industry is many companies try to understand how do we use global data. in the right way. So on one hand, as financial institutions, as bank, we have to protect and keep it private, the data of our customers. We cannot just share it with anybody. It's our obligation under compliance and under regulatory rules to make sure that the data of our customers is safe. But on the other hand, we have to understand how we can work with other financial institutions together to create a network of global data to share with one another. And I think this is the right way for us to address first party fraud. And if you think about this, just like you said yourself, you know plenty of people who opened 10 bank accounts in the past 5 years,
Yeah.
right? But if I open 10 bank accounts, and with every bank account I go and I do fraud, right? I defraud the bank for $2,000, for $5,000, for $1,000. How do we bring this information into one place? So the next time I go and open a bank, the person who will review my application will say, hey, but he opened already 10 bank accounts, and out of those 10, he did fraud with 8. I probably don't want this person as a customer, right? So how do we create that network while keeping the information of our customers safe? And how do we use it for our advantage as fraud fighters? But also when we're building those global networks and we create those consortiums, it's also important for us to think about the ethical aspect. So, for example, if we have a person today who is maybe young, maybe he's a high school kid, and he, playing around, doing some fraud, doing some chargebacks, doing some disputes, maybe making some online purchases and then dispute them later, or just do some other types of fraud. But eventually that person grows and, his morals and ethics become on a much higher standard. And now he wants to become, a good citizen. He wants to build a family. He wants to create his own business. He's not doing fraud anymore. How do we make sure that this person, even though he was tagged in the consortium and labeled as a fraudster, is being white labeled over time? So I think once we start building those big consortiums and global networks of data, it's also important for us to understand from ethical perspective at what point we can white label a person who will no longer be considered as a fraudster anymore. And I think we will be very busy with those questions in the next decade. I'm very excited about, I see many companies trying to create consortiums, and I'm very excited to see where it takes us as an industry.
Sounds very interesting. Looking forward for these solutions. I believe it's going to be what scare me a bit in these white label solutions, that once Frosters realize it's going to be options to become white label, they're going to do everything to we might see increase of compromise accounts, and we might see a lot of people who fake it until they make it. If you know what I mean.
Yes, absolutely, and this is why fraud is so fascinating, because it's a never-ending battle. If someone thinks that we can completely stop fraud and just eliminate it from the face of the earth, this will never happen. Because as long as there are opportunity, as long as there are loopholes, as long as there new technology that drives new financial products that make financial products more available, there will be people who will find a way to get in and to create the financial damage and get out without being noticed. And that's why I think this is one of the most exciting industries to be working in.
Sounds very promising. Let's see. When it happens, I believe we need another recording for
I'm
speaking
just
about
creating
it.
a job security for myself for the next 20 years. Don't
It's
don't
good.
bother me.
You sell it, you know. You can
Yes,
keep this video, and if someone gonna ask you, just like send it over. Say, I believe we need to work
absolutely.
with this one.
Yes.
Thank you, Alice, for joining me today. It was a pleasure. Really interesting to hear your story about your transition between countries and industries, and your approach how to hire people and what we need in fraud prevention and where it's going. It was very cool, and I'm looking forward to posting this one.
Thank you so much for having me. I still think that being a fraud fighter is one of the coolest jobs in the world. And for people who might be listening and thinking about taking their first steps in fraud prevention, don't hesitate. It's a small industry, big problem, and we usually have a very, very fun days every day doing our job. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. I'm gonna say my favorite word on each episode, which is cut.